So, Stacie, this was a very succinct description of what you see as deficiencies within our system, especially when it comes to the credentials of those working with our young children, and what you think might have to be put in place to advance the issue and get to a point of a more unified set of competencies and credentials that would define us. So if somebody were to have a conversation with a child care teacher, that's the terminology we use in Maryland, it would be clearly understood what that person had gone through in terms of pre-service and what kind of credential the person would hold, and that would be something that's more consistently applied to the entire field. Now, you offer questions, and a number of questions I think some of us in the audience would like to get a little elaboration on. And I wrote down some of those points, and then maybe we can have Jacqueline and Pam respond to that. You see a system that's highly fragmented and driven by certain policies that are sort of rushing out and being ahead of addressing the issue of those that are working in the field to have the knowledge base and the competencies to keep up with those kinds of policy advancements that we had seen over the years. Could you just elaborate what you see as that kind of fragmentation in the field? And do you feel that the field has started to think about this in some ways in how it can be addressed?
I think there are at least 3 questions in that.
Okay.
I think to start, I want to pick up on the public policy piece. And I want to be clear in terms of my perspective that I think policy is an important partner to any field that is organized as a professional field of practice. And I often look to nursing as one of a profession that we can learn from, and so I'm going to use that, I think, as an example in this instance as well. So the difference, if you will, and then how nursing, but you could apply it to physical therapy and physicians and attorneys and many other practices that are organized, is that it's the profession that uses its knowledge base to determine what its standards of practice should look like, and then partners with policies in order to create the conditions so that those practices both can be present, widely present, and also accessible. And the difference that I would say in terms of what we've been experiencing in early childhood education is that we are being driven and formed as a field of practice by policy rather than being in a relationship that where as an organized field of practice, we are using our knowledge base and using that knowledge base to help to define, again, what our practice should look like. And I think one of the best examples I could probably give where we might have, could have debate about whether or not it reflects best practice is in the presence and use of play, for example, in early education settings. Another might be people's points of views around assessment, knowing that that will offer Jacqueline a perfect opportunity. But looking at assessment and the nature of that assessment, not necessarily the presence of assessment, but the nature of that assessment. So then I think segueing to your second point, if I can hold on to all 3 of them, what I think we need to do in order to then step forward is to begin to confront our own, as I use the word culpability, but our own responsibility in helping the field to be where it presently is in terms of its fragmentation and lack of unification, because until we're willing to acknowledge that we are part of the system that we are trying to change, it's going to be very challenging to move forward. And that then we need to actually engage with the question about whether or not we want to truly be a professional field of practice and are willing to engage in the choices that will be required if we want to move forward. Did I answer all of that?
I know you're moderating, but I really want to speak to this. I think the fragmentation for early childhood is an important thing to understand. Unlike the world of K-12 that receives less than 10% of its funding from the federal government, early childhood receives most of its funding from child care and Head Start, and you know, now the state-funded preschool is coming along. And the fragmentation, I think, comes from those various individual programs that were developed in an attempt to be helpful. So Head Start is there with its regulations and its criteria that are different from child care, that are different from Title I, that are different from the special education legislation. So I think the fragmentation at that level is a function of multiple funding sources with multiple regulations. And I don't think that that was an attempt to fragment. I think it was an attempt to help, but done in a kind of uncoordinated way. I believe that what we have at this point, at the federal level at least, is an attempt to have greater coordination. And with your winning Race to the Top Early Learning Challenge application, you are in the midst of that work of having a unified set of early learning standards and the like. But that fragmentation still exists, and I think it leads to a workforce that is defined by policy. And that's, I think, the kind of thing that is a concern to me, that in times when you have legislators, program administrators, advocates who are strong in early childhood development and understand how children learn, then you can have some policies that are aligned to what we think is good practice. That isn't always the case. And so there are times when you have legislation and regulation that's defined by things other than good practice, other than what we know about child development. And so I think, as Stacie talks about this core body of knowledge, the field hasn't really defined what is the core body of knowledge that we need to have as a field, that we own, that defines us and separates us from others. And if we don't have that, and we can't say this is who we are and this is who we're not, then we are at sort of the whim of the political tide, and the political winds change. I'm from New Jersey, so I know how the political winds change. Then we see them blowing back and forth, and we get defined by policy. And so when Stacie says policy shouldn't drive the field, I think that's right. I think that public policy can support the field, but what we'd like to see is a field that owns itself, defines itself, knows who it is, and gets support for its further growth and innovation from public policy.
Okay, thank you. Pam, your field of professional development, you've been doing this for so many years. What do you consider these core competencies to be that we would need to have in early childhood that each state, you know, should embrace?
Yeah. What a, I mean, as the goddess of the world, I should be able to address this question because I think that's the devil is in the details of how do we define those core competencies, who should define those core competencies, and who's going to be involved in that discussion. And in my worldview, I can see very clearly, and I should say my worldview, my background is early childhood special ed. And so I'd like to ask in this room, how many of you are from that particular world of early intervention, early childhood special ed? So there are a few hands being raised, but so important that we have all the voices at the table when we think about questions like what are the core competencies. And what I envision is this continuum of core competencies that are articulated at different levels for different subgroups of our field. And as you think about that continuum, the basis is child development, early development and learning. The foundations of our field are there. And different folks who are operating at different levels of our field, whether you're an early childhood teacher who's at a baccalaureate degree, or you're an early childhood teacher in an AA degree or a CDA degree, you have different funds of knowledge that map onto this continuum. That leaves room for the specialists who come in from the early childhood special ed, allied health, and those different professions that contribute to our field, that are part of our field, yet often aren't part of our conversations. So that there is a pathway for folks around a common set of standards or standards of practice that people can tap into at those different levels. And what is the problem I see? You asked for concrete levels of fragmentation. I can, in working with states, and I won't name the state, but I was asked to help the Child Care Resource and Referral Network in a state develop some curricula on inclusion and for their statewide TA network to use, because they said we do training on this topic, but there's no standard curriculum. It's whatever anybody knows or can think up on the fly. And so my first question was, well, have you brought in your 619 and Part C coordinators who also have a network of specialists in this state who know a lot about inclusion? Well, no, we haven't really talked to them because they don't understand our folks. They don't understand our child care community and who we're trying to reach. So that's an example of if we had a core body of knowledge that everybody said, yes, this is our core, this is our foundation, and these are where the different groups in our state tap into this core and need to know whether it's foundation or specialized knowledge. There's a place for everybody in this continuum. And I sometimes I wish I had a diagram. I like to think of two triangles. One looks like this and one looks like this, and they're next to each other. And at the bottom of this one, this is for general educators, there's this large base of foundational knowledge in child development. This triangle is for specialists, and it's inverted because they need to know about child development, but they don't maybe need to know the huge amount that the group over here needs to know. They need to know maybe this amount. At the top of this triangle is the specialized intensive interventions needed for children with disabilities. At the top of this, where the specialists are, there's a huge body of knowledge that they need to know about the intensive, individualized interventions for children with disabilities. But both triangles have the same core body of knowledge. It's just recognizing the depth. And so that, to me, is a way of going about. I don't know what the core body of knowledge is. I could conjecture, but that's a way of going about thinking about it that is inclusive, I think, of at least the worlds that I operate in.
May I just build on that very quickly?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I'm coming from a similar way of thinking, but want to offer maybe just a slightly different twist on it. I think one of the ways in which we can potentially start thinking about how we organize ourselves is, again, now I'm going to think about physicians, if you will, and use them as an example. So as you know, anyone who wants to enter the field of medicine has to have the same shared body of knowledge in order to become a physician. But then what happens after they get that MD degree is they start specializing. So sometimes somebody might be a pediatrician, they might be an internist, they might be an oncologist, right? I mean, we could go on and on with those specialties. So the physicians are all bound together by that, they're socialized. I mean, that's one of the important roles of preparation. It socializes us to, in terms of a frame of reference as a profession. And then you can start thinking, though, about those specializations and what additional specialized knowledge do you need. So I think one of the considerations we should bring to this conversation is whether as a field of practice, in contrast to what we presently do, which is just to tend to think about a career ladder or lattice as adding credits and hours, is rather to start thinking about the roles in the field as specializations, and different specializations as requiring, over and beyond that core, a specialization. And then what is the additional knowledge that you might need for that specialization? So being a child care teacher, for example, the knowledge base you need for that could well be different than the knowledge base that you need to be a pre-K teacher. And so this definitely works, but I'm just trying to frame it, I think, in a slightly different way that people could think about, because now we tend to think of the word continuum is the one that for me is a little problematic, because the continuum implies that they're just building. But rather what it might be when you're thinking like physicians is, again, you have the same base and foundation, but there could be lots of different, again, specializations that build on that base. And I think it would help us address a number of issues, because pediatricians, for example, are not as well paid as an oncologist or a radiologist, but the difference is not tied to the respect and importance of their work, because I got to tell you, I hope never to have to use an oncologist. And so the one I'm going to count on is my internist. And I'm going to respect her and need her a great deal. So it's not an issue of respect, it's the difference in the depth that you may need to go in order to practice that particular specialization.
Mm-hmm.
A question for Jacqueline, because in her work with the U.S. Department of Education and being on the receiving end as a state administrator, I did get the clear sense that the race to the top criteria that were established, probably based on hundreds of hours of discussion and
Hundreds.
did try to attempt to get beyond the fragmentation, to set a stage for professional competency that's defined by the states, and to set up vehicles or mechanisms to get that kind of these outcomes of the profession disseminated to the field. There are two questions that I have for you. The first one is, as you had these discussions, were there points where you felt that the barriers and the way our system works here, maybe compared to other countries around the world, in such a way that it does almost set a barrier for moving ahead in that respect? And then the next question is that, did you feel that in some of the discussion or what the states are now working on is some good examples of how these barriers are being not only addressed but also overcome?
So the United States is really interesting in its educational structure. I mean, anytime you can have a presidential election and you have a candidate saying, demolish the Department of Education, is fascinating, because the rest of the world cannot understand this. It is just incomprehensible. And so with this federalist form of government, in fact, the federal government does not have a lot of authority around education. The states have responsibility for education. So the federal government is not responsible, as you will hear Secretary Duncan say, for the Common Core curriculum. That's the National Governors Association and CCSSO. So you have this tension between the states, who have ultimate responsibility for education, and the federal government that has to have some kind of regulatory authority, but it is sort of, what is the incentives that you can have? I think in the political atmosphere we were in when the Obama administration began, you had a president and secretary of education who wanted desperately to raise early childhood education to an important level. For Secretary Duncan, it was an important part of school reform. You have to start very early to be able to get to the president's agenda, which was increase college completion. And that was start with early childhood. So the goal was also to not add a lot of programs, which is always easy, just have another program. And so you're quite right, Rolf, in saying that a major goal of the Race to the Top Early Learning Challenge was coordination. And in the very first part of the application, when everybody goes crazy, you're asked to talk about your early childhood landscape. All of these pieces of childcare and Head Start and state-funded money, that what are you doing? What does early childhood look like in your state? And those conversations were really interesting, because I looked back at my time in New Jersey, and I know that while I ran the Abbott preschool program out of the Department of Education, we really didn't have a lot of communication on an ongoing basis with the child care folks, and we did with the special ed people, but because that's what we wanted to do. Everybody's busy doing their work in their silos. So I think what you see right now as far as public policy is a sense of no new programs, because there's not money, and new programs are always conceived of in the minds of legislators as new money. But how do we leverage what we have? How do we really pull things together to be able to say we are using all of our early childhood money in a more coordinated way? And clearly you guys did that very well, because you ended up with federal funds to continue that coordination. So we see things going well, and it was an interesting thing that even though In the beginning, folks argued about the Early Learning Challenge money, and certainly from the perspective of the two departments that were trying to jointly administer this work, we didn't always see eye to eye, and we had to battle out what we thought was right. We came to, I think, a place where we felt comfortable asking states to do certain kinds of things for coordination. And even when the winners were announced and folks who worked very hard realized that they hadn't gotten funding, we got lots of input from practitioners and governors saying, this was a good activity. We'd never come together and had those conversations before. We really needed to understand what the folks in special ed were talking about, what Head Start meant. And so I think what we saw nationally for those 37 states in the beginning that applied was, for some of them, the first time they'd ever started to ask, how is this other part of early childhood really functioning? How do we come together? How do we come together as a potential field that understands each other? At least what are our similarities and differences? So I saw that, for the last part of your question, I saw that across the states, even the states that were not funded. But we just have this unique history and setup in the United States. You know, part of my job was to represent the Secretary at OECD, and these are the developed countries, European countries, and they find it fascinating. You know, you're really having a discussion around healthcare, you're really having a discussion around standards, and so we are somewhat different, except for Germany, which has the same kind of federalist. But it is a matter of giving the states, or acknowledging that the states have the ultimate authority for education, and figuring out the appropriate role of the federal government. Again, because the federal government has funded so much of early childhood, they're a huge player in this. And my concern remains that they be a huge player in terms of a supporter, in terms of funding innovation, but not in terms of defining the field.
Yeah. Now, that leads, I mean, we have a few more minutes to have the discussion, and then I wanted to open it up to all of you to maybe ask a question and then have, you know, break then at around 10:30. One question that I had, and that's very critical, and that we see this in our work. When we talk about core competencies, it means what you do in the classroom, whether you have the professional tools, if you will, to address the needs of the learners in the classroom, and to make it work so that those children are learning, they're progressing, and you prepare them for something that comes next. In this case, formal education, if you will, school. So the question that I have is, for 10 years or so, we've been talking about early learning standards. And I do recall when we tackled that with the previous administration, 2003, when under CCDBG, we needed to have standards that would apply to any early childhood sector, the field. It was seen as a little bit of an affront to some that were in the field and said, well, what's the use of that? The question that I bring up is provocative as yours, in a way. What would be the use of standards if you don't have a corresponding system of core competencies, pre-service, continuing education, and a clear notion as to how would you implement those standards across the board for all age groups. And I like Stacie's talk because I see it as one area that has not been seriously touched yet. This notion of early learning. How do we define it? What happens in the classroom? What do we consider to be the positive outcomes we're looking for? We have something in Maryland, but I see it across the country not necessarily a big issue. I see talk about systems building and other things, but about what happens in the classroom is not being clear. Pam, any thoughts on that?
Well, I think that is the question of the hour, and it's the standards, maybe what you call the standards of practice, the evidence-based practices that support these outcomes for children. And in some respects, I think researchers are in this mix, in this conversation, because they're the ones that hold that evidence that research-based evidence. Yet I think most of us would say if we only practice what we have strong research evidence for, we would be very paralyzed, because we have research, but we don't have research for every single decision that a teacher has to make on a daily basis. So we need a mechanism for integrating the research with the best available research with the wisdom and the values of the families we serve and the teachers who are doing that work, who have funds of knowledge based on their own experiences. And I think that evidence-based practice movement and how we define evidence-based practice to support the competencies, the things, the standards of practice is something that is important to tackle. I think there's a lot of work being done there, but it's fragmented. For instance, the Division of Early Childhood for the Council of Exceptional Children, we're just in the midst of revising our recommended practices, and we're trying to bring the research base into that more strongly. But that's taking place in a silo. And so how does that map on to work that NAEYC may be doing in that area, or the Head Start Association?
Jacqueline, could you talk about the National Academy of Sciences work a little bit? Just to touch on it, and
the new consensus committee?
Yeah.
So the National Academies 11 years ago did Neurons to Neighborhoods, published that, and that was a consensus group of folks who experts in the field coming together to look at the science of what we know about children birth to 5, and that really did just enlighten the field in an enormous way. And so we now know a lot about young children, but it was very interesting because the academies, along with the departments of education and health and human services, started having conversations around the workforce. And you talk about core competencies for children, core competencies for adults to be able to get children to these core competencies. And so the academies now has in progress a consensus study that will look at what we know about young children's growth and development and learning from birth to age 8, so it builds on Neurons to Neighborhoods, and how we use that information to inform our knowledge of the workforce. What are the core competencies that folks need to be able to move children on to be successful? And they're really different. I mean, we can have great standards for young children, but we're not going to get there unless the people who look those children in the eye every day understand young children and understand how to move those children along. So the academies is really looking at this consensus study as a way to inform our work and our knowledge of the workforce, and to be able to inform public policy, to be able to inform practice. So that's a short version.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, and I would, in my most recent work, I am thinking about organizing as a professional field of practice as the missing system. So when you think about how we currently are doing our systems building work, we tend to talk about subsystems, and we have professional development as another subsystem that is aligned with several others. And my contention is that a lot of the issues that we are creating for ourselves is because we have not defined the core system, which is early childhood education as a field of practice. Because then when you start looking at issues, say, of coordination and of access, you're looking at it in the context of what is it that we are trying to coordinate and what is it that we want people to access. And so I think we've all sat in the room and had these incredible, lengthy, and frustrating conversations that are so challenging because we don't know who we are as a field of practice. And so it makes it much harder then to do the kind of systems building that we really are trying to do. So I would say that organizing ourselves as a profession is the missing system. And though in terms of your question, if we recognize that much of what we're doing in professional development is really preparation, it's not professional development. It's preparation to do the work that we want people to do. And it's a bit of a euphemism because it allows us to keep thinking we're doing something that's professional when we really haven't yet taken the step of defining ourselves as a profession. And that would move us then towards answering what I think is really, I agree, that is the question. And that is the question that's in many ways being raised by Leading for Our Profession.
I just want to add, I think that as we move in our particular areas, if it's at the state level, if it's individual programs, I think people just decide what is good practice. And we move forward because you've got to do your work. And so you have a state deciding what good practice looks like, you have programs deciding what good practice looks like, and we're just all moving along. I think there's overlap, but I think one of the things that would be enormously helpful would be for folks to come together with their various notions of what good practice really means and to really talk about it in a very practical way. And maybe even show it, because it's always interesting to hear folks talk about their fabulous program and you go in and you think, oh my word, you know, this is really scary. But they do think it's good practice. So no one's saying, I have a really bad program. We just really don't do well at all. I mean, you never hear that. And I think we have got to really start talking, get down from this generalization of good practice and come down to the reality of what are we doing, what are we really talking about, so we can move forward as a group of people who have this one uniting intent, and that is to do good work for children.
Okay. So before we have a few folks here pose any questions to you, Stacie, your idea of the inside-out change, meaning that within the field we'll have the discussion, what kind of suggestions can you give to each and every one of us? We have folks here that are working in the classroom, some are supervisors, we have directors of programs here, different sectors, you know, public school or the public sector and the private sector. So what can each and every one of us here do to, as a next step?
Start engaging in the conversation. And to, this sounds like a plug, and I guess it is. I would hope people might actually read the book. And then would invite people to engage in the conversation about whether or not we really want to organize as a profession. Are we willing to step forward and to make some of the really hard choices, and invite you then to think about, I have a colleague in Austin who had a book club with a wine and cheese at her home to discuss the issues. So I think there are ways in which we can use our various auspices and homes and friendships and relationships, and to start engaging in this conversation and start having some of the really hard conversations that we need to have. So along Jacqueline's point of kind of moving beyond some of the kind of superficiality. And it's a given that none of us want to harm children. That we're doing what we think is the best. What we're really raising is that what we think may be the best, in fact, may not be, and often is not. And one of the things that I'm actually hoping for is a next step, and if y'all can join with me in helping to think how to make it come to fruition, I would love it, is I would love actually to create a conversational guide that could be used widely across the country that would help these conversations to go forward in a way that have some kind of shared issues that people are addressing, so that the conversation again across the country could build some momentum, and that there would actually be a way with technology that people might respond who are having these conversations to a couple of core key questions, like what's the biggest obstacle or hardest debate for people to be engaged with, what was the low-hanging fruit. We might start pulling some of that together and begin to use that information then to take the conversation to the next level and to be a little bit more systematic, and then in turn begin to start thinking about ways to have those conversations be more widely held. Think of like a strand at an NAUIC conference or a DEC conference. Start pulling those pieces together, and then ultimately could move to something that Jacqueline has proposed, which is to have some kind of commission that then comes together and interacts widely with the field to take us forward. But it would have this body of knowledge that it would use to be able to inform its deliberations, because we as a field would be with this commission in this conversation, because there's no sense moving forward until we have started to create a movement that says we want to change, it is time to change, we need to change.
We are now transitioning to the next part of the agenda, and thank you very much for a wonderful, lively discussion here.